problem with it is it's become so easy to access, federal loans, often, especially unsubsidized loans, could be north of 6% for some borrowers, where interest is accruing from the moment they borrow that money. And I think because of the age, right? I mean, what 18-year-old, I know it certainly wasn't me, is really understanding the impact and weight of capitalized interest.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I decided to do a little bit of a mini-series on student loan debt. And I think it's because we often don't hear the voices that I think we should. I remember as a student that we weren't given much education on student loans, on debit and credit, on interest payments. It just wasn't there. And yet young people today are signing up for student loans to the tune of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars without any real knowledge of what they're signing up for. I came across Tim Ulbrich's work. He's the co-founder and CEO of Your Financial Pharmacist. I'll leave a link below. He authored an article called "It's Time to Broaden the Conversation About the Student Debt Crisis Beyond Rising Tuition Costs." And in the article, Tim talks a lot about financial education and awareness, but also the other pieces of tuition that we don't talk about, including rooming and boarding costs. Interestingly enough, Tim graduated from the Ohio Northern University Doctor of Pharmacy program with over $200,000 of student loan debt. Him and his wife, after realizing they were living paycheck to paycheck, began to aggressively pay back that loan and were able to do so within 3 years. And this fascinated me. I wanted to learn more. So this is my conversation with Tim. I really hope you enjoy it. A couple administrative notes from me. Oh man, one of the pain points in podcasting. Unfortunately, my computer picked up the stereo mic and not my microphone here, so I apologize for the audio. As well, at some point in the podcast, the light in my background falls. The things you learn as you podcast and you do these things regularly. But I apologize. Those are just blunders on my end. But I hope you enjoyed the conversation nonetheless.
Tim, thank you so much for joining me here at the Open Minds podcast. First, you're the co-founder and CEO of Your Financial Pharmacist. Tell me a little bit about your story, because your story is really fascinating when it comes to student loans in America.
Yeah, thanks, Christopher, for the opportunity to be here. I'm looking forward to the discussion. So, yeah, Your Financial Pharmacist, our mission is to help pharmacists, that's really our niche, achieve financial freedom. I am a pharmacist by training. I graduated in 2008 with my Doctor of Pharmacy degree, did 1 year of postgraduate residency after that at Ohio State University. And I, like many pharmacy graduates, found myself a little bit surprised by the amount of student loan debt that I was in. And it shouldn't be surprising, right? But it was, and certainly I have responsibility in that. But I went to a direct entry PharmD, Doctor of Pharmacy program out of high school, where I did both my essentially undergrad and graduate work, all in a straight shot of 6 years. And the best way I can describe my student loan position when I was in school is it felt like monopoly money. And I didn't understand unsubsidized loans and the impact of those and how they're different than subsidized. I didn't understand, how interest could both grow and then eventually capitalize. I didn't understand loan repayment options, all of the nuances. I'm sure some of that we'll get into here on this interview. And because of that, I graduated, finished residency, and I found myself in a little over $200,000 of student loan debt. And the unfortunate reality is that anytime I have the opportunity to speak with a group of pharmacists and I show them the average debt load of a pharmacy graduate, or I share my story, there is no emotional reaction to that number because we have become so used to these debt loads. And the problem was for my journey is I really wasn't intentional about how I was going to address my student loans as well as the other financial goals I was working on, in part because I was living under this false notion of, hey, you're going to make a great income. It'll figure itself out. Yeah. And the reality is it doesn't figure itself out. We've got to come up with a plan. And so long story short, my wife and I, we wandered for a few years, kind of spinning our wheels with our loan repayment journey. In 2012, we had a really pivotal experience through learning a lot about personal finance, reading books, listening to podcasts, and really had this aha moment when we looked at the difference between our income, what we had earned, and our net worth. our assets minus our liabilities. And in that moment, 2012, I realized, wait a minute, we're making a great income, but we're not progressing financially. And so we said, hey, we've got to start being more intentional with setting goals and having a bold vision for our family and our financial plan and getting serious about the budget, which led to, in fall of 2015, paying off that $200,000 of student loan debt. And from that point, I started blogging about the topic, and that led to some speaking opportunities. And we created a podcast back in 2017, which is hard to believe that was, five plus years ago. And
that's amazing.
Eventually partnered those educational efforts with fee-only financial planning, all really in the niche that is customized to the pharmacy professional. So that's the backstory, and the mission we're on is to really help develop a financially well pharmacist workforce.
Tim, first of all, that's incredible. As a Canadian, we can't sometimes relate to the level of student debt that a lot of American students find themselves in. So when you say 200,000, it just goes over the head of many Canadians, because many of us may not have that level of student debt. But what's fascinating about your story is that you take that 200,000 and you and your wife absolutely crush it over the next 3 years of repayment. Talk me through a little bit about the mindset shift, the behavioral shifts that you had to make during that time, because often, I've had these chats with people before about student debt. It's the level of debt, financial literacy and financial education really hinges upon human behavior.
That's right.
And there's so many studies about, financial literacy courses may not necessarily translate into better behavior.
Yes.
But in your case, I feel like your behavior dramatically shifted. So walk me through, what kind of helped you, in the first year or second year when you're like, oh man, I really need to spend money on other things other than my student debt. What kept you going, and how'd you maintain it?
That's a really good point, because it wasn't, financial education that was poured into us. It was really us buying into and taking ownership of our financial situation and really self-initiating, where we wanted to go and why we wanted to go there. And for us, and I always encourage folks, if you're working through any financial challenge or issue, cast the vision of where you want to go. So if we imagine ourselves in a scenario with, you've got no student loan debt, or for people that are, saving or investing for the future or looking to buy a home, whatever the goal is, if you imagine yourself accomplishing that goal, what excites you? What's the dream? What's the vision of what you're trying to accomplish? Because that becomes the anchor for the month-to-month grind or whatever you're trying to do. It all comes back to living off of less than we make and delayed gratification. Yes. And, we've got to find this balance between, saving for the future, paying down debt, but we also have to live a rich life today. And there's a constant tug and pull between those two things. And so you said the word that was the transformation for us, which was mindset. It was a complete behavior change. And it wasn't we're making all these mistakes, or we're taking on all this credit card debt, or we're buying these fancy cars. We were living a fairly, I would say, benign kind of normal life, but we weren't being intentional. And those are two very, very different things. And I personally had to get out of the mindset of, because I'm a pharmacist, I'm going to be financially successful. Just because you're a pharmacist or a physician or whatever high income earning professional, that in and of itself does not mean you're going to be long-term financially successful. So it was that shift in mindset, that shift in responsibility, and saying, hey, if we don't develop this plan ourselves, then something's going to happen along the way that we're not in control with, and it's not going to be in alignment with this big vision that we have for our family. So it really was that mindset shift. And, starting with that vision allowed my wife and I just to get on the same page with, okay, this means for us, we decided aggressive debt repayment. That may not be the case, for everyone else, especially borrowers here in the U.S. Loan forgiveness is a very viable option, but we decided aggressive repayment. And that meant significant sacrifice. We had a young family at the time. And we decided that it meant, giving up some of the things that we enjoy doing, but we knew it was temporary. And we knew that it was because we wanted to achieve this long-term vision that we had for our family into the future.
That's amazing, Tim, because I can imagine, during those 3 years, things like family expenses come up, travel expenses, wanting to do different things, wanting to maybe buy a better car or a nicer house or live in a nicer area. And those are the things that really a lot of people struggle with, because in university we're not told too much about the salary expectations and the debt loads and interest rates, as you mentioned. Instead, we're taught about look at the prestige of the job that you'll get, look at the the acronyms after your name kind of thing. And for students who are graduating, let's say with $200,000 of debt, similar to yourself, and are thinking, I want to get out of this as fast as possible, but maybe I want to live in a better area code. I don't want to be in my current living situation. How can they kind of help shift that mindset to one where it's like, let's be super aggressive, let's think long term, let's create a vision for ourselves where in 5 years, 10 years even, we're out of this hole and we can kind of fully go on with our lives without this debt burden over us?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that long-term vision here is really important to help under maybe something short-term that we've convinced ourselves is less than ideal. Cost of living is a great example, right? I talk with pharmacists every day, every part of the week, where unfortunately pharmacist salaries don't really adjust accordingly with cost of living. So, I live in Columbus, Ohio, pretty reasonable cost of living area. And a pharmacist here versus a pharmacist living out in San Francisco or New York City, they might make, 10, 15, maybe 20,000 more, similar types of roles, maybe, but, cost of living is much higher than 10, 15, $20,000 more on average per year. So, one of the moves I encourage folks, if they're willing, to make it, is if you've got some very aggressive / exciting financial goals, especially early in your career, what we know is when it comes to financial momentum, especially time value of money and growing your assets, those early decisions are going to have a long-term compound effect that is going to be harder to catch up to at a later point in time. So if you're willing, to move from, let's say, the Northeast or out West to, Midwest into Ohio or, across the Great Plains and work a pharmacist position for 3 or 4 years, focus on your goals. And now you're choosing location, lifestyle, other goals, but you're choosing it from a position of financial strength rather than a position where you're playing financial defense. And that mindset shift is incredibly different. And then, we all know, I think just from, life experience, that time goes by a lot quicker than we think, right? Any given day or week can feel long, but any given year can feel very short. And so, really assessing, how big actually is this sacrifice? Feels big, feels weighty in the moment. But if I fast forward 3 or 5, 7, 10 years, like, is the potential reward, that much bigger, that I'm willing to make some type of sacrifice? Could be, picking up and moving, could be other types of cuts and expenses, whatever it be, delaying a car purchase, but any of those sacrifices, I think as time goes on, the reward of it will be great.
You're right, Tim. And, I think what's fascinating about your story too is that you developed this at a relatively young age. So, I always think about the young people that were struggling with debt right now and student loans. When I was 16, 17, I had no idea how banking worked.
That's right.
I had no idea what in Canada here we have, similar to the US, it's a 401k. We call it the RRSP. I was like 16, had my first job, and someone just walked me in and said, you should start an RRSP. Had no idea what that was, interest rates and all that. And yet, students these days at that age are being loaded with debt and no understanding of what this means long term. So how can we kind of help with the education system, help students understand what they're getting into before they get into it? Because I feel like there's a lot of decisions that we're almost being forced to make at such a young age when it comes to our financial futures that, if we're not provided that education, our behaviors may not necessarily change as a result.
Yeah, and I think there's good intent here, but bad execution. So, for example, I'll give the U.S. Student Loan Department of Education example. The intent of opening access to federal loans is very good, right? You increase access to education. Education, in theory, becomes more affordable. The problem with it is it's become so easy to access, federal loans, often, especially unsubsidized loans, could be north of 6% for some borrowers, where interest is accruing from the moment they borrow that money. And I think because of the age, right? I mean, what 18-year-old, I know it certainly wasn't me, is really understanding the impact and weight of capitalized interest.
Yes.
Not happening, right?
Exactly.
And so I think that, there are some things we just have to learn probably the hard way, and that's just the reality of life. I do think there's some, maybe guardrails we could put on, does interest rates have to be that high when it comes to, higher education? Obviously, we could argue, tuition, cost of living expenses, a lot of things that we could do, access to scholarships. But I always go back to really core foundational personal finance education. I think if we're really going to move the needle on this topic, it really is going to come down to, do we have a strong foundational knowledge that leads to the behavior and the mindset that we know as positive actions? Does not mean we're not going to make mistakes. Does not mean we're always going to get it right. I think there's a certain level of maturity where we begin to appreciate, these things, but we are often playing catch up in this area. And I think sometimes we hit people with like 1 or 2 or 3 sessions of financial education. We think that that's going to be transformative, entrance loan counseling, exit loan counseling. Well, when somebody's going into school and they're getting entrance counseling, they're just focused on starting school and making sure they're successful, right? They're not really thinking about the weight of their loans. When they're exiting school, they're thinking about that first job and the transition, everything that's happening. They're not necessarily thinking about, all the details that are coming in the exit counseling. So I am a firm believer. I mean, of course, perfect scenario is we have strong personal financial education that's happening in the home. If I were somebody who's kind of looking at this as a policy standpoint, from a government, we can only, do so much or depend on so much, obviously, that's happening consistently across the home. But to me, like K through 12 education here in the United States, like personal finance should be core curriculum. And I think we're seeing a shift. I forget the exact number of states now in the US, but it's moving. Ohio is adding it coming up here in the next couple of years as a requirement. But I think it has to, just like drug abuse education, just like other areas we've come with good policy, it has to be early and it has to be longitudinal. Those are the two things I always come back to. If it's sporadic and it's not early, it's not going to have the positive outcomes I think it could have. If it's longitudinal and it's early, touch points from K through 12 and then into higher education, then I think we start to really move the needle on some of these issues. So, we're trying to really impact this at the pharmacy school level. And I think there's benefits there, but it's already at the graduate level. I mean, think of all the behaviors that have already been learned, and all the foundational education that may not be there or that has been lost along the way. So, in a perfect world, we're doing that in higher education. And we're not looking at pharmacy schools or medical schools or any school and saying that personal financial education isn't or shouldn't be a part of medical school or pharmacy school. It should, I think. But we're building on ideally what's already been established in the K through 12.
It's fascinating that's amazing that's happening in Ohio. I think that's incredible. I had this chat with someone else on my podcast about the education system and at times how antiquated it could be in terms of the curriculum change, but then other times it's super nimble. So here in Canada, I remember going to school at a young age, not learning anything about our First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. And now it's a real big part of the curriculum. In 2008, we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission up here, and governments, provinces, and the federal government have committed to more truth and reconciliation initiatives. But what's fascinating is the curriculum really changed almost dramatically. Like overnight, it seemed, at least to me, that, wow, some of my kids, their kids were starting to learn about the Anishinaabe, the Algonquin. I was like, this is incredible. It took me till university to learn about our First Peoples. And so it's in a way, the education system was so nimble in that sense. But when it comes to financial literacy, I find that it's a bit more challenging because there's so much to cover, and maybe students are all coming from it from a different perspective as well, that it might be hard to kind of tailor that curriculum. But I want to know your thoughts on that, given that it's such a personal topic. Do you see resistance from parents necessarily saying, I don't know if I feel comfortable with the student or my student learning this in class?
Yeah, I've never, and again, I'm coming from the perspective of higher education. So I think there's very little, if any, I've never had any personally resistance from like parental units. I think that's a very real question, like in the K through 12. So, you mentioned the topic is personal. Everyone has different philosophies and beliefs around money. You get into topics like, giving is one part of the financial plan. People feel very differently on that. And so how do you develop a curriculum that can be, that broad, but still be meaningful? I think that's a really good question. And I don't know, if that's really been fleshed out, to details, but I think you bring up a really good point about how antiquated yet how nimble the educational system could be. We're experiencing it, here in the U.S. on some really important foundational issues that, I think back to my educational experience wasn't that long ago.
And we're basically the same age. Yeah.
The viewpoint I was taught about history, like, just to be frank, was like not correct, and it was biased.
That's right.
So,
That's right.
and that I think has really evolved along the way because of, appropriately so, the right amount of influence and input that should be on the curriculum. And I think when it comes to personal finance, I don't know if there's enough pain yet from the decision makers. There still is a thought, I would say, among some, certainly not all, but among some pharmacist faculty that maybe graduated 20, 30 years ago that didn't have $150,000, $200,000 of debt, that are well off financially at this point, that, they may be feeling that, like, hey, this is pharmacy school. This is not personal finance school. It's not our obligation. And, I think that shift is changing. I think the openness to dialogue around money is changing. For many folks, they might have grown up in an environment where it's a taboo topic. And so I think that the shifting is happening there. But what I have found in partnering with many colleges and organizations is the most successful ones, it comes down to, is there a decision maker that is passionate about the value of personal finance? If the answer is yes, that is a culture that is embodied across the school. If the answer is no, there's a lot of status quo. And, that would be my encouragement to listeners that are out there. Like, if you have a position or role of influence within an organization, within a college, really bringing this topic forward as an opportunity. Because I would argue, it's not just about education in personal finance at K through 12. To me, employees would value, as an employer, benefit of having personal finance education. I mean, the literature is pretty compelling that, like, if your employees are feeling that they have more financial strength or they're in a better overall financial position, well, then they're probably a better employee. They're not carrying the stress of that into the workplace, and it's not necessarily, impacting them from, hey, I've got to look for, another job so I can earn a little bit more here or there, because they've built a solid financial plan. So this really is a thread, in my opinion, that should be beyond the even just the educational system. But I think there has to be enough pain there to make a change, right?
You're totally right, Tim. In fact, this dovetails into, the number one cause for divorce is our money issues. And so if people knew that there was a safe space to talk about this, maybe with a trained professional, individually or with their partner, how much can be alleviated with those kind of, like, really tough upfront conversations about where do we see ourselves 3 to 5 years from now, and what baby steps are we doing each day to do that. I think making that a bit more normalized is really important, because I think in some cultures it is very normal to talk about money and finances, and it's a big deal, and kind of people are very open about that. But in others, it's not. And I think that the more we can kind of bring it to the surface and normalize it, similar to how we're normalizing many conversations on social issues today, that were just completely taboo when you and I were children. It wasn't that long ago. So I do think that there's a role that many actors play in this. But I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about your article that you wrote, which is it's time to broaden the conversation about the student debt crisis beyond rising tuition costs. This is, again, something that I always wonder about, because when we talk about student debt, we kind of always think about the tuition costs, but your article really breaks down a whole host of other costs that students incur. So before we get into the article and some of the pieces I wanted to discuss with you, what compelled you to write it? It sounds like, based on what we've discussed, financial education and literacy is really important to you, but also you really want to get away from just the tuition costs when we talk about student loans and student debt.
Yeah, and I think this is, I wrote that article a decent number of years ago, and this conversation is front and center right now here in the United States with the Biden administration announcing some changes around student loans and some debt cancellation and some other things. And the feedback that's come out from that announcement is many folks are like, hey, that's great, but it's not getting to the core issue, which is the underlying costs of higher education. Those aren't necessarily changing, which is a whole separate debate, right, in and of itself, in a for-profit, non-for-profit type of debate as well. But I think what is front page now, and what always has been front page, is higher education costs equals rising tuition. And certainly tuition costs have a huge role, probably the primary role in seeing, indebtedness go up over time. If you look at the rising cost of higher education in the United States and you benchmark that across, inflation, it's not even close. You certainly could argue, well, it makes sense that tuition goes up as the cost of living goes up, but it is way beyond that, exponentially beyond that. Yeah. And so then that begs the question of like, well, why is that? And why is the indebtedness going up so much? So what struck me is if you look at the pharmacy school indebtedness in 2010, the average indebtedness for graduate was about $100,000. And here we are in 2022, and it's hovering around 170, 175. Now, inflation, outside of right now, we're all experiencing inflation, but inflation was nowhere near, a $75,000 increase on what was $100,000 10, 12 years ago. Yeah. And so what I was feeling at the time of writing that article is there's a lot of things that are contributing to this that nobody is talking about. Like interest rates. Why are interest rates on federal loans so expensive? Private loans, maybe you could argue that makes sense, but federal loans, why are they so expensive? And what about unsubsidized loans? For subsidized loans, at least while you're in school, the government is paying your interest, so that interest is not accruing and then compounding. But on unsubsidized loans, that's not the case. So what happens is many graduate loan borrowers vastly underestimate their total debt load and what they're going to actually pay out of pocket because they're not thinking about interest capitalizing. And so what I'm referring to here is if you, let's say as a first year pharmacy student, you borrow $20,000, in your first semester of 8 semesters, and you're accruing 6% interest from the moment you borrow that. Well, that 6% interest is accruing in a separate bucket the second you start borrowing that money. And then when you enter repayment after graduation, the interest gets added to the principal, and then that starts growing baby interest, right? Which is capitalization. And so often borrowers will be thinking, oh, well, I take out $15,000 a semester, I multiply it by 8, and that's going to be my debt load. And they are way off because of capitalization of interest, both while in school and then also during the loan repayment period. So, we don't talk about interest rates enough. We don't talk about, unsubsidized loans and the disadvantage that can put borrowers. And we don't talk about borrower cost of living expenses.
Yes.
Right. There's shared responsibility here. And, obviously there's often a need for cost of living expenses, but the way these loans are often issued, it is, hey, here's the maximum amount that your financial aid package allows, sign on the dotted line. And really, I think ideally in a perfect world, we're kind of setting a budget, and based on the budget, we're borrowing what we need. And natural human behavior is if somebody gives you $30,000 and your tuition costs 20, well, what's going to happen with the other 10, right? And I think we all are going to spend it in different ways, and maybe we look at that and say, well, it could be 7 or 5, which doesn't feel significant in the moment, but it does when you're talking about unsubsidized loans that are compounding interest over time. So, I've seen pharmacy students that are borrowing, north of $20,000 a year for cost of living, types of expenses. So, is the debt load only the responsibility of the institution and the tuition? I think the answer is no. I think a big part of it is, and I think we should be having a very healthy debate about, why does higher education cost as much of it is? What's the return on investment? And I think, that certainly it is ongoing. But what about these other things like interest rates and unsubsidized loans and, looking at things like cost of living expenses are topics that we often don't focus on as much, which led me to really highlight that in the article.
Tim, that is so fascinating about the interest rates. So I know that student loans are the biggest asset for the United States, but I did not know about the interest rate calculation. So it's not only the interest that you pay on a per semester basis, but if you will have outstanding debt at the end of your 4 or 5 year degree, there's interest on top of that loan as well. I mean, that is, so they get you coming and going. So they're double dipping when it comes to interest. I mean, that's
yeah, you're paying interest through the life of the loan. So this gets in a little bit of the repayment, but the second, and again, I'm talking about unsubsidized loans specifically, because that's really what is the focus in higher education here. The moment you borrow that money and while you're in school, interest is accruing. And then once you go into active repayment, interest gets added to the principal. And then to the comment you're making, while you're in active repayment, which the standard default option is 10 years. Now, you can pay them off faster, and there are actually options that you can pay them off slower as long as 20 to 25 years. But the longer you go out, obviously, the more that's going to be. So if you look at just round numbers, the average debt load of a pharmacy graduate, what they'll have around graduation typically works out to about 170. At the end of 10 years, they're probably actually paying out of pocket somewhere around 220 to 250 because of how that interest is accruing. Now, if they take it out longer, that number goes up. If they pay it off shorter, that number goes down. So that's a really interesting to me, like, policy question. I'm oversimplifying it, for conversation's sake, but why are younger individuals that are going through, higher education expenses, is there a way to promote access to education without crippling people with student loan debt?
And the thing is that makes total sense if you're building an asset like a house or doing whatever you need to build your asset and build your net worth and your wealth,
right?
That you can then leverage for other things. And the fact that you're doing that for, I hate to say it's a liability, because education, I believe, is an asset. But when we look at it in these terms, it seems to me like a big liability, and it actually prevents you from, getting the maximum amount of, let's say, loan that you could get for a mortgage. So if you and your partner
That's
are
right.
thinking of buying a house, like if you have $200,000 of debt, student loan debt, that's a liability that prevents you from maximizing your potential.
Yeah.
An asset.
Yeah, and it does. I think what you're getting at, and I think we don't like to be told that, maybe our educational experience is a liability, but I think we got to call it for what it is. But I like to think about it, and this is true of any decision we make in the financial plan. It has an opportunity cost. Now, it might be that it has a very direct return on investment, but we have to consider that, going through school for X number of years, paying off interest, those are dollars that aren't used elsewhere in the financial plan. Now, you weigh that against earning potential and you weigh that against other things, but we have to be honest with ourselves about anytime we make a financial decision, there's an opportunity cost. So in this case, you could argue that if you didn't have to pay that interest, you could invest or save for the future. That could compound. You could buy a home earlier, start to build some equity. But to your point, when student loan borrowers go to borrow a home, there's only a certain amount that the bank's going to let you borrow based on a debt to income ratio, and student loan debt is a debt, right? It's a liability. So it does have an impact, and it certainly can have a impact into other parts of your financial plan as well.
Tim, I know we don't have, I feel like there needs to be a part 2 and 3 to this conversation.
Yeah, it'd be fun.
But I noted in your article, one thing that I found fascinating is your distinction between school and financial institutions. And I just want to read a brief quote here from your article where you say, by nature, the financial advisor may or may not be operating in a way that supports the best interest of the pharmacy graduate. While this potential conflict of interest is true for all advisor-client relationships, it's especially noteworthy for pharmacy graduates who are facing 6 figures worth of debt, often with a high interest rate, and are in need of holistic financial management and planning that spans goal setting to debt management to retirement savings. This is fascinating to me because when we think financial planning, we think, I'm going to go down to the bank and talk to a financial advisor. But you highlight that their role is to sell a service. And instead of going to that advisor first, there's a need for holistic financial management planning. And I love that because I've never seen it crystallized that way. How do we go about this path of holistic financial management and advice, and where would a pharmacy graduate go for that information?
Yeah, and it's really interesting here in the United States. This is something I learned through my own journey of, paying off some debt and starting to build a business. And I was interviewing different financial advisors, planners, just trying to understand the landscape. And one of the naive thoughts that I had is that in our profession of pharmacy, we are drilled into our brains that you are legally obligated to act in the best interest of the patient always, period, end of story. And what I was quickly realizing when I was interviewing financial planners is like, that's a whole different industry that, we can debate whether it makes sense or doesn't make sense, but that is not the case. And actually the vast majority of financial planners in the United States are not legally obligated to act in the best interest of their client. Doesn't mean they're bad people, doesn't mean, they don't provide valuable advice. It means the system of bureaucracy has been set up in a way where it is still largely a market that is funded by advisors, planners, wealth managers, whatever you want to call them, that are recommending a product. Could be insurance, could be investments. Sometimes they're in the best interest of the client, sometimes they're not. But by nature of selling something and getting a kickback, there's an inherent conflict of interest in the advice that they're giving. And what's fascinating is here in the US, there's a big push, although it's not required, for financial planners to be held under the fiduciary standard. And the fiduciary standard says that you legally obligated to act in the best interest of your client. The other standard is called the suitability standard, which is where most financial planners reside, which is where it doesn't have to be the best option for you, but it has to be arguably suitable or appropriate. Well, you can see where that becomes problematic in terms of gray area, right? So, you know, you could recommend an insurance product in a vacuum that may or may not be ideal. Don't know anything about your student loans, don't know about your other goals. It's suitable, but it's probably not the best, you know, product for you. So there is a movement going on here in the United States towards the fiduciary model, and more specifically, what's called fee-only financial planning. And fee-only financial planning is really trying to move towards that you as the client are paying an advisor or planner, whatever you want to call them, for the advice that they're giving, not because they're getting a kickback from an investment product or an insurance sale. And so that is starting to really kind of blow the smoke away in some regards. I think we've got a long ways to go, but that's what I always encourage folks as they're looking for a comprehensive solution, is making sure that there's a model that you understand the pricing, you understand the nature, and hopefully is one that is transparent and you feel good about. And so the problem with many new pharmacy graduates is they are a target for less than ideal financial planning solutions. And because of that, they might find themselves in models that aren't really addressing the things that are most needed to be addressed, and that aren't necessarily giving them the advice that they need, you know, with their long-term plan in mind.
Yeah. Tim, I know I only have a few minutes with you. I want to ask you one last question, because I do think that there should be a part 2 to this, because I'd love to know your thoughts on the Biden administration's loan forgiveness and so many more topics. So we can definitely schedule something.
Sure.
But I'd love to know, and I was just thinking back to myself in university, and like hypothetically, if I were a pharmacy graduate, let's say I never discussed finances during my time in university, and now at the end of my pharmacy graduation, I see $170,000 sitting on my student loan balance, and all this anxiety comes over me. Maybe I start my career not knowing the salary expectations because I was never told the salary expectations in university. Or maybe I was, and I'm not making that. I'm making much lower because I'm a junior pharmacist and I'm just starting out. I'm filled with anxiety. I'm filled with doubt. I don't know how to kind of like make my life kind of go forward with this, straddle with this student debt. What are some of the strategies that we can help deploy to those students that are feeling that right now as they kind of graduate into their career?
That's a great question. And there are many things I would include that should be in that bucket. But the one that I always start with is that we have to have a system and a plan, and ideally automate that system that gets all this stress and anxiety and unknown out of our head and on the paper. And this is really transformational. I've worked with folks, you know, and I live this my own situation where, you know, they've got $200,000 student loan debt. You know, they're behind on saving an emergency fund. They're trying to save for a home. They're starting a family, buying a house. They have all these things going on, and there's getting paralyzed by just so many different things that are happening at one time. And you can fast forward 3 months and the numbers haven't changed a whole lot. The student loan debt is still largely what it is. They're still working towards these goals, but they've been put on paper, and we're beginning to create buckets towards these different goals, even if the buckets are not funded anywhere near where we want them to be. And I would encourage folks here that do not underestimate the power of a plan and momentum, even if the numbers are not changing significantly this month or the next month. Because this is a topic where we chronically carry stress around, because it's a constant dialogue in our mind. You know, am I ahead? Am I behind? Should I be doing this? What about this? What about that? And there's so much value in getting that onto paper, start to work a plan. You know, you check in once a month, you automate it the best you can. There's a lot of strategies to do that, and then really start to work the plan forward. That will really change some of the anxiety and the stress right away.
You're totally right, Tim. I totally believe in compound interest. I think that's evident, but you're right. Having that the systematized plan where you don't, you know, if it's $100 this week and it's $1,000 next month, that's fine. Just keep at that plan, keep hacking away at it, because if you keep hacking away at the principal, you don't pay as much in interest. But this was a wonderful conversation, Tim. I feel like we just scratched the surface on these really big topics. I'd love to invite you back, so I'll send you what I'm thinking for.
Yeah, please do.
But thanks again for shedding light on this. Thanks for your article. Thanks for all the work you're doing with pharmacy graduates and graduates in general. They need to hear what you're saying. So anything I can do to help promote that, I'm more than willing to.
Thanks so much for the opportunity to be here. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Okay, that's it.